Hey everyone, Mark and Steve here.
Before we get started today, we want to let you know about Dare to Connect, our new online interactive video platform.
For less than the cost of a therapy session, you and your spouse get live access to both of us 3 times a week.
Each 30-minute live group support session provides interactive mentoring and healing for addicts, spouses, and couples.
If you're loving our podcast and our unique style of bringing you recovery, you're going to love Dare to Connect.
To learn more, go to daretoconnectnow.com. We're looking forward to seeing and working with you. Hey everybody, I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSC Squared podcast.
Hey everybody, Mark and Steve on the PBSC podcast. Last time we did episode 110, which was TV, movies, and media in a betrayed relationship. And that was part 1, what to do if you're the addict. And today we're going to do part 2, what to do if you are the spouse.
Dun, dun, dun. Yes.
And just to give you a precursor of today, Steve and I sort of have a pre-arrangement before we started recording today. That I'm going to take devil's advocate. I'm going to take the position of a betrayed spouse. And as Steve and I start to talk about the things that you can do with this as a spouse, there are some difficult topics here that we're going to introduce you to. And it is absolutely understandable that you're going to have some reactions to some of these things we're going to say. Because they're going to seem like, wait a second, that doesn't sound fair or right, or, lots of different reactions you'll have.
Yeah.
So as Steve presents some of this, I will step in and say, wait just a minute, Steve, are you saying, right? So I actually enjoy playing devil's advocate because Steve, he's awesome. He is for so long and just has so many elevated, evolved answers that I just love trying to pin him down, which I never can, but so you'll see that happening today as we kind of go forward.
See that, everybody? See how Mark uses flattery to not be the bad guy.
To not be the bad guy to you.
He's a wise man, that guy is. Okay, well, it is. I mean, I'm glad to kind of lead the charge on this side of the discussion because I really do like this topic a lot. I in my practice, I see a good amount of addicts, spouses, and couples, and lately, over the last year or two, it seems to have gravitated almost towards I'm seeing more spouses and couples than even addicts, and really do have a special place in my heart for we both do for our spouses who are stuck in a situation that they didn't sign up for or ask for, and nobody jumps into a relationship even when we know about the dynamics involved with the betrayal, whatever those are. None of us, I think, jumps into this with even the capacity to be even able to touch on the gravity of what is involved when it comes to betrayal on in the sexual realm and sexual compulsion and addiction. And so
you can't really know until you're in it, unfortunately.
No. And so we're going to try to keep this concise with this being a podcast. We know that our time here is limited, but we will be referring you to some other past episodes likely as we go through this. But really quickly, I guess I better just do a quick recap. Reason why we had selected this topic is we had a spouse subscriber last week and we read the full thing last week, but she had more or less asked the question, how do I hold boundaries with my addict partner, around him basically objectifying and going to a place of lust when we consume media together, right? When we're watching movies or TV shows or whatever, I have caught him before, looking up actresses after the fact, or, I'll catch him, kind of in that place of mid-lust as we're watching these things or together, and it's really disrupted our process. Like, what boundaries can I hold with that?
Yeah.
And so last week we talked all about, how addicts can help set the stage for changing this dynamic. And today we're going to answer that question directly. How do we navigate the boundary side of this? Because it is really complicated, especially when it comes to, so much of this is internally within his head. So how do we kind of do that? So as I jump in, apparently on the chopping block, I'll kind of tell you where my initial thoughts go to this, but and having worked with, I might be in the thousands. It's, if not, probably the mid to high hundreds of spouses over the years, including my own, as we've navigated our own recovery process. I'm going to introduce some concepts that might be a little uncomfortable, but we're going to do our best. And Mark will call me out on my stuff and I'll explain where we need to and all that jazz. But kind of step one to this is doing one of the hardest steps to this is step one. And that, as a spouse, is being willing to begin to entertain the idea of, how can I better let him own his own crap or his own stuff?
Yeah.
Right. Now, and what I mean by that, before we get too into it, is, how can I what do I need to be doing or changing to ensure that I am 100% allowing him to own his addiction, to own his actions, to own his own lust or his own thinking or his own thought patterns and processes, his own background. And this is really hard for a spouse. And usually when I work with spouses, I can almost hear spouses listening right now. They're like, well, of course that's his stuff to own. But usually when I start to dig with a spouse, what we find is that, in ways that aren't always obvious, spouses of addicts oftentimes continue to maintain an implicit or sometimes explicit burden or responsibility or ongoing pressure to somehow work, maintain, create, provide for his recovery, right? His change. They get pulled into this idea that I have to, in order to find my own healing, we've got to get him healing. And too often an addict's healing, without a wife even realizing it, she will begin to own pieces of that. And if she doesn't at the beginning, it's easy to get caught in that trap. And so there has to be an ever-present, ever ongoing effort to make sure that when it comes to his actions or inaction, when it comes to his lust or lack thereof, when it comes to him working his recovery versus not, at the end of the day, that is 100% his job, right? His job. Your job as a spouse is not to change him, to police him, or to mind read him. What your job is to hold your own boundaries in response to his action or inaction, not to change who he is.
Well, as I hear you say that, Steve, you're saying, okay, you spouses out there who are in a relationship with an addict, you need to stop trying to change him, policing him, being hyper-vigilant, mind reading, looking where his eyes are going. You need to let go of all of that. Just let go of all of it. And the first thing I'm thinking is, whoa, wait, hold on a second, Steve. How can if I let go of all of that, how can I possibly have a sense of peace and trust in this addict partner?
Yeah.
If I let go of all of that, that makes me more vulnerable and at risk than I can possibly begin to imagine. I think I'll be a nervous wreck if I let go of trying to keep track of him.
Yeah, it's a great question. And let's just recognize that every spouse listening is going to be on at a different place on the spectrum of this, right? Some of you are probably really adept at this, especially those who are attending 12-step groups or working with a therapist will probably have some good initial boundaries and groundwork formed around this. But I know that even for those with good groundwork around this, there's a real fear component, right? There's this notion that in order for me to feel truly safe, I need to be somehow changing this or leading the charge with this or making sure that I get ahead of him hurting me or betraying me or, get ahead of his own acting out or whatever. And so too often we find ourselves doing the bushwhacking. You find yourselves, I should say, doing the bushwhacking as a spouse. And the reality is, and this is where Mark's going to start jumping in here. The reality is that no matter how, I've been doing this a long time, and so I tend to kind of cut to the quick with it. It is totally understandable why a spouse would want to do these things. One, because you want to feel safe, you want to feel connected, you want to have peace, but two, because you care about your partner and you don't want them to be stuck in this. But the reality is that at the end of the day, you do not have the capacity to save him or to compete with his addiction. You don't.
Yeah, and you know, everyone listening, one of the things to really understand in this as well is if you're feeling yourself moved, you know, compulsively moved towards keeping track of him and looking at his phone and trying to figure out what he's been doing or not doing, or, you know, where his eyes are going in public. If you're doing all of that, please know that is a very normal and expected trauma response. When we've been betrayed and traumatized in our lives, we, of course, naturally the brain's going to say, look, I'm not going to be blindsided again. I'm going to make sure that I pay attention, that I'm super vigilant, because I'm not going to let that happen to me ever again. So it's very normal that you would be using these tactics and these strategies, as Steve said, to make yourself safe, to not be, you know, blindsided and smashed again in the future. But yeah.
Well, and that's part of the problem, right? Is in the short term, right? Some distance in this area and even in the long term in some ways can be helpful. The problem is that it can easily cause us to become stuck, right? Because there's a lot of emotional expenditure that goes on the part of a spouse who gets caught up in, for example, the hyper-vigilance of trying to make sure, right, that an addict isn't exposed to bad media or isn't, you know, caught up in that, et cetera. As we've said before on here, one of the things you can't ever become is the policewoman in a relationship if you want it to work long term. Not only will your connection with him suffer, but it will become so exhausting you'll walk. You just will.
Yeah.
Nobody can maintain that forever.
No, it just dominates your life and uses up all your energy so that you don't have anything left for anything else.
It absolutely does. So this hardest part then really is that piece of it, right? Is letting him own that 100%, and really surrendering. If we borrow a 12-step concept here for a moment, surrendering your perceived control or desire to control that, or even maybe the fairness of feeling like you should be able to control that, away, and giving that away, whether it's to a higher power or in some other way that resonates for you. And we do have, again, lots of episodes for that.
And as you say that, Steve, you know, whenever I work with spouses and we start now to talk about this concept of letting go, surrendering, right, leaving it in his court, there is this crazy feeling of vulnerability, dangerous vulnerability, right? It's kind of like you're clinging to the side of a cliff and you have a safety rope attached to you. And I'm now saying, let go of the safety rope. Yeah. And just scale the cliff. And part of it's like, whoa, wait, what? Are you insane? Right. And the biggest question that is natural to have is, so if I let go of all this hypervigilance and keeping track of him and trying to control it and taking responsibility for his progress, what if he ends up betraying me again? Yeah. Now you've left me vulnerable and you've increased the risk, and now I'm going to get nailed, and I'm going to say to you, why did you tell me to let go and surrender? He did it again. Yeah. I could have prevented it if I had used all those other strategies that I was using. Yeah. Well, and that's where part of this acknowledgement has to go to, right? Because for a spouse who says that, and I really do have empathy for that, that's where you have to ask yourself, could you prevent it? Could you actually prevent it? I have worked with hundreds of spouses who have tried. Mm-hmm. And especially in the day and age in which we live, in an age where I have watched spouse after spouse and addict after addict engage with one another like on an emotional Cold War of like there's an arms buildup of, you know, she low jacks his car, and so, you know, he figures out where it is and learns how to disable it. You know, they get it. They put all these things on his phone, and he goes and gets a burner. I mean, there's just this never-ending, right, dialogue and dynamic in the quest for
trying to control his sobriety.
Yep.
Now, it's not to say, and we talked about this more in the last episode, that there isn't a value for that on some level, because we ought to have safeguards in place for blatantly obvious pornographic material or things that are going to violate safety or decrease connection, of course. But as we talked about in episode 1, on the day-to-day interactions or engagements that we have, whether it's in media or with, his attractive sister-in-law or, people that you guys see at church or, whatever it is, right? The list just goes on. At the end of the day, there is no way to control and regulate all of these things. And that's why I would lovingly pose that question. You have to ask yourself, is what you're doing really working? And is it working in a sustainable way? Because usually this is what happens. The more a spouse tries to control that, 1, it prevents him from changing and growing. 2, it limits your ability to develop trust out with him, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And 3, it usually causes both people in the relationship to resent each other more. You will be angry with him because you are expending all this emotional energy, and there's that never-ending expenditure we've talked about. And he, even though he may not even realize why, will do the same thing, because just like no wife can become the policewoman in a relationship, no addict can become the child in one either, if the marriage is going to work.
Right. Well, and as we kind of step back now, then we talk about her, you as a spouse surrendering up and letting go of all of that with regard to him and making him 100% responsible for his own recovery and progress. The question now becomes, well, what can you do? And one of the things, Steve, that you and I talk about a lot, but we were talking about it with regard to a situation today. And this might sound strange, but I'm just going to throw it out there. All of you listening, you must be enough. You must be enough and be okay and have innate value, regardless of what he does or doesn't do. And I know that is a crazy difficult principle to get your arms around. If you can't be enough without him, you're going to probably find yourself tapping into these hyper-vigilant and controlling and keeping track of him strategies. Can you be enough? Your own sense of worth, your own healing process, your own outside support system that has nothing to do with him, right? Can you stop competing with his fantasies or suspected fantasies, right? Because you'll never win against those. None of us can. You can never compete with a fantasy world and be more than that fantasy world to grab his attention or connection.
Well, so that's just it, right? Because connection happens through invitation. And that's the hardest part of this whole process, I think, for spouses, is after the betrayal, the natural response is to want to take control.
Yes.
And that's why boundaries become so important, kind of going full circle now with the answer to this question. It goes back to what I said at the beginning, right? My job as a spouse, at the end of the day, I have to let go of his recovery, and I have to let go of the pieces of this that I can't control while fully owning the pieces of it that only I can control. And that's where most spouses get stuck in the big scheme of this.
Right. So how do I give away and let go of the things I can't really control? And how do I fully embrace the ones that I can?
Because this is where most spouses find themselves to one degree or another. They find themselves trying to control parts of this that they can't, which leads to everything we've just talked about. But then they also times are transferring ownership without realizing the things that their husband can't control to them. Most specifically around the choice to trust again. At the end of the day, I have worked with many spouses, and it makes sense, right? From a fairness perspective, like we talk about it on here often. He's the one who betrayed me. Why do I have to do the work? And when it comes to the work, in many ways, you don't have to do the work. The analogy I always use on here is growing a plant, right? When we talk about two spouses and their roles in this recovery process and the role of healing betrayal and the role of setting boundaries and all of that, the addict's job, the addict absolutely has a huge part of this burden. I would never tell a spouse, just trust him again, because it is a choice, but it would never be as simple as, well, just trust him again. Just trust he won't hurt you. What's the big deal? He is supposed to be doing a mountain of work, much of which we talked about in episode 1.
Yeah, go back to episode 1.
Proactively seeking for your safety, creating connection, developing out transparency, providing accountability, verifying with you what he can in his recovery patterns and processes and the things that he's doing, sharing insight with you, right? Providing empathy and creating a space for you to express hard emotions, providing a place for you to grieve. All of those things and many more that I'm forgetting right now here in the moment are all on him. But at the end of the day, he cannot make you trust him. And I work with so many spouses who find themselves, without even realizing that they are until I phrase it that way, when they get honest with themselves, they realize that in some ways I kind of am waiting for that. I'm waiting for him to somehow do something that will make him, somehow it's going to create enough of an environment that I will have no choice but to trust him, because why wouldn't I? And the reality is you have been wounded and you have been hurt and you have been betrayed. And choosing to trust again is just that, a choice. It is a choice. And it's one that we should make on a very informed level. And again, all those other pieces should be in place. But like with my plant analogy, he is the sun, the soil, the fertilizer. He's all of that, but you're the plant. You're the only one that can choose to respond to those things or not. And I'm no way saying that that is something that you should do. Everyone's situation is different, and he may not be providing the necessary environment for that to happen. And if that's the case, that's where the boundaries become. That's where the boundaries come into play. Answering this subscriber's question, your boundaries ought to be around what we're talking about today to our podcast listener. They ought to be around him providing that proactive safety for you. And then you ought to be holding consequences for good or for bad around whether or not those boundaries are acknowledged and respected or not. And then using those boundaries as the guide to help you to make the choice to whether you trust him again or not. And coming up with, for you, what does that look like? In order for him to create that ideal growth medium, using my plant analogy again, that's how I should be looking at this if I'm a spouse trying to form those boundaries. In order for me to have the optimum environment in which I could make that choice to trust him again, what are those needs? And that is what I'm going to express with him. And then likewise, if those needs aren't met, what will that mean for connection with us?
Yeah, because one of the questions that comes up immediately, Steve, as we talk about all this, hey, great, Mark and Steve, you talked about all the things he should be doing, that this is primarily on his shoulders. But what if he doesn't do all those things?
Yeah.
What if he refuses to? What if his progress is crazy slow? What if he keeps relapsing? What if all of the ideal soil and environment and sun and nurturing and fertilizer and all the stuff he's supposed to be doing so that I can choose to grow in this relationship, what if that isn't happening? Now I got to go back to control again.
No, and I would say absolutely not, because you can't go back there. Going back to what you said, Mark, before, it's important that we kind of address this. You had said something interesting. You said, so how can I possibly have this as a spouse? Can I have a sense of peace and trust taking this approach of trusting him? Right. Well, the answer to question number one, right, is that sense of peace. Again, ask yourself, are you really feeling peace? You're never going to get peace from hypervigilance. You're never going to draw pure water from a tainted well. That bucket is never going to come up filled with peace, ever. Peace comes through the letting go that we're talking about. It comes through the recognition of what actually is and honoring his God-given agency to choose and to make either really smart, intelligent decisions that gravitate towards you, or to make very poor, unwise decisions. To quote my favorite Indiana Jones quote, he may choose poorly.
He may choose poorly. Yes.
He may choose poorly. But that's again is the risk, right? That's where the peace comes from, is surrendering that piece over. And the trust piece is implicit, because oftentimes I've heard wives say that same thing. Well, how am I going to trust him taking this approach? You're not trusting him right now anyway, if you're taking that other approach.
Yeah. If you're hyper-vigilant and looking to control all aspects, do you trust him?
If he's got a metaphorical gun to his head, or you've got a gun to both of your heads, and you're saying, I trust you, that's not really trust. Right? The only way to get to that place of trust is to literally take that action. You rather than you trying to utilize feigned control, and I use that term because it's not real control. Rather than trying to use feigned control as a way to find safety, we find safety in the surrender. We find safety in the recognition of you're you and I'm me, and I choose you, and here are the ways in which I need you to be able to choose me to choose you. And you'll either do those things or you won't.
And this is where the real safety comes in, is the safety of boundaries. Here's what I need from you in order to be willing to stay in this relationship. Here's what I need for you to be doing in your recovery. Here are the things that I am going to be doing in my healing. And if you are unable or refuse or just won't make progress in those boundaries, here are the outcomes.
Yes.
Here are the outcomes to your choices. That's where the safety comes in. If Y happens, then X will take place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, we understand, ladies, that this is incredibly hard to hear, as always.
Beyond hard.
But it is the way forward for freedom with this. It's recognizing and letting go of that thing that we fear most in the world, that maybe he won't choose you. And that is the crossover with recovery, right? Are we both willing to choose each other again and to keep choosing each other as we go through this process? Sometimes the answer is no. But to implement control or to avoid that question, we'll do Mark, a minute ago, you used a pretty telling analogy. You said, here I am hiking this cliff, Steve, and you're telling me crazy because you're telling me I have to let go of the safety pylon in order to go anywhere. Yes, I am. Because as long as you keep holding on to the same way of doing it, you can keep clinging to the cliff, but sooner or later your grip is going to wear out. And that same safety piece that is maybe in the short term created some sense of perceived safety and maybe even some real initially, is the very thing that's going to keep you stuck on the damn cliff.
Right.
You have to unclip.
Right.
It's the only way to move up.
Right.
Is to do that and to approach this from a new way of letting, and that's where you find your voice, right? Through 12-step and therapists and our really amazing program, Dare to Connect, which is a 3 times a week, 2-week trial included program for addressing this stuff on an interactive basis with Mark and I 3 times a week. We would love to have you come join us and give that a try for 2 weeks free at darenow.com.
We're going to end the podcast. We don't want to just leave you on the cliff.
No.
So come on over to Dare to Connect and come over and participate with Steve and I on our Partners Wednesday.
Absolutely.
And we get into much more detail about this, but we appreciate all of you, especially your spouses listening. What you go through is, you can't even begin to comprehend. You are all so heroic to us.
Just to be listening and working on this is it's incredible. Because many, rightfully so, would just say, forget it. I'm out.
Yeah. And you're here and you're listening and you're trying, So we
absolutely.
Yeah. Our hearts go out to you.
Awesome, ladies.
All right, everybody.
Okay. Have a great rest of your day. Find your voice and again, involve some people that you care about, that you trust in setting those boundaries, but love your relationship enough to set those through a lens of, hey, I need you to be doing these things, be providing this level of safety so that I can be letting go in these healthy ways and we can really move.
Yep. So, all right, everybody. We'll see you next time on PBSE.
Have a great week.
Everything expressed on the PBSE podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.